Hey, everybody, welcome back to our journey through the Bible. In our daily readings, we began yesterday with the book of Isaiah, and we're gonna work our way through that text over the next couple of weeks, and then we're going to take a brief bit away from that and then come back and finish it up in May. Some of it's going to sound very familiar. Isaiah's call story in chapter 6 is going to bring up reflections of a favorite hymn. At various points, we'll come to those treasured texts that we hear so often at Christmas, and some of it, of course, is going to be far less familiar stuff we don't engage very often. Before we head down that road, however, I want to take a couple of minutes today to set kind of the more general stage for this central prophetic book of the Bible. Our Old Testament readings in the coming weeks will centralize on many of what are often referred to as the major prophets of Israel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so forth. And we're going to come back to this notion of being a prophet in a few minutes, but I want to explain that the book of Isaiah is really understood to be the compilation of three prophetic books from three prophets that spanned three distinct periods in the life of the people of God. That's a key thing about this book because it's important as we read these prophetic words to understand the context of the lives of those to whom these words were first proclaimed. The first section, often referred to as First Isaiah, is chapters 1 through 39. It's the biggest chunk of the book. That's the portion that was written by the actual prophet named Isaiah, who spoke during the 8th century BC, the years of the divided kingdoms when Israel to the north had separated from Judah to the south. Second Isaiah, sometimes called Deutero-Isaiah, is chapters 40 through 55. And this is the portion of the text that was written during those critical years of the Babylonian exile in the early to mid 6th century BC. And then finally, the tail end of the book, Third Isaiah, starts with chapter 6 and runs through the end, and was authored during the period of the restoration of Judah and Jerusalem after the exile, the same time period of the books of Nehemiah and Ezra that we explored just a couple weeks ago. Now I say all of this as a backdrop to just highlight the political and experiential realities that surround the words that we're about to read. And for those of you who are reading along each day, I encourage you, just take a little Post-it note or something and stick it somewhere where you're doing the reading with those brief details about each section so that you have in mind what's going on in the people who are hearing these texts as you're reading it. For today, I simply want to draw our attention to the opening words of Isaiah and talk about this notion of being a prophet at all. This is Isaiah 1. Verses 1 through 6. It says, "The vision of Isaiah son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Hear, O heavens, and listen, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner and the donkey its master's crib, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Ah, sinful nation, people laden with iniquity, offspring who do evil, children who deal corruptly, who have forsaken the Lord, who have despised the Holy One of Israel, who are utterly estranged. Why do you seek further beatings? Why do you continue to rebel? The whole head is sick and the whole heart faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there is no soundness in it, but bruises and sores and bleeding wounds. They have not been drained or bound up or softened with oil." As I mentioned before, as we move into Isaiah, we move into this stretch of our daily readings that surround this this group often referred to as the major prophets of the Old Testament. The word prophet literally stems from the Hebrew that means one who announces. The prophet was one who proclaimed truth to the people. More specifically, in the context of our faith, it was one who proclaimed God's truth to the people. The prophets are seen to have been a mouthpiece for God. As you read through the prophets, you'll note that they're most often not speaking their own words. They are declaring the words of God. The words of their mouths, the words of these texts, are implied as the direct words of the Almighty. They are literally functioning as God's mouthpiece. What so jumps out to me in these opening words of Isaiah, however, is the challenge that would have been created and the difficulty that would have been created by that reality. These are not easy words that Isaiah is proclaiming. Isaiah is looking at the challenges that the people are facing, and he's proclaiming that these challenges are a direct result of their behavioral and faithful abandonment of God. And the language only gets worse. The critique only gets more severe from where it begins. Read on in chapter 1 and you'll see some doozies. One can barely imagine the problems that this would have created for Isaiah, the strife and dissension that this would have caused in his life, but he did it anyway. And this is true for so many of the prophets. Convinced that these were the words that God had inspired in his heart, he stood up and he spoke out, regardless of what that meant for the relationships he held or the life that he knew. Whenever I come to these early chapters of Isaiah, I'm taken by his willingness to stand up and step out for the purposes and the words that God had instilled within his heart. He was willing to risk what he needed to risk. He was willing to face the repercussions that would come from being the one to speak the hard truth to the people. He was willing to he was willing to set aside his comfort and ease if that's what it took for him to be true to the call that God had made in his life. It's hard to be the one to stand against in this world. And to be sure, I'm not suggesting that any of us are called or compelled to put our lives and our relationships on the line to become the mouthpiece for God in the manner that Isaiah and the prophets did. I do think, however, that it's just so easy to shy away. It's so easy to gloss over those sharp edges. It's so easy to find ways to turn a blind eye to those places where we know we should speak out because we don't want to risk what we know we'd risk if we did. I'm not in any way suggesting that any of us needs to be the next Isaiah or the next Martin Luther or the Martin Luther King or the next Rosa Parks or any of the many of others of those who truly inspired people and brought new life and new light to the challenges of this world. I am saying, however, that there are those moments in which God is longing for us to use our prophetic voice, for us to speak his truth into a circumstance that we see. And I just think we all need to be just a bit more willing, just a bit more ready to step out for God and to step up for the word of love that God has inspired within us. Let's be in prayer together. God of love, we're so grateful for the chorus of prophets on which our faith stands. We're so thankful for their heart, their faith, and and the courage of conviction that has shaped the world and the faith that we know. Help us, God. Help us to find just a bit of that courage, an inkling of that trust that we can, in our small ways, follow their lead. Help us to know ever more fully the word you inspire in us. And help us to see ever more clearly those places where we too need to step out and stand up for the word of love you've inspired us to proclaim. In his name, amen. Thank you again for being with me. I hope we'll see you either in person or online Sunday morning at 9 or 11. And I'll see you back here next Tuesday for our next installment of our journey through the Bible. Have a wonderful